Welcome to the Gospel Ambition Podcast. The Gospel Ambition Podcast is a ministry of Grace Players Church. Grace Players Church exists to honor God by multiplying devoted followers of Jesus through worship, community, training, and witness. And today I'm joined by Pastor Mike Yoder, Executive Director at Encompass World Partners. Mike, thanks for being with me today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So you and I have a unique relationship that has lasted, some 14 years or so now. I can remember when I first met you. You and I met, you may not remember this. So we met playing basketball. You were the candidate to be the lead pastor here. We were in the hospital with my father-in-law. We were kind of going through some tumultuous times. You were candidating. I remember somebody said, like, hey, would you like to come play? We know you've been, it's been a difficult season. Would you want to come play basketball with the new lead pastor? And like, yes, we just needed a break from something. And that was how we met, though. You were, again, candidating to be the lead pastor here at Grace. And you got to know our story. You're one of the best question askers that I've ever met. And you just were asking me all kinds of questions where we were in ministry. I was in seminary at the time. And, so our relationship kind of started there. I came here as an intern, eventually as you became the lead pastor. And then we worked together for a lot of years here on staff. And then when you took your executive director role and I became lead pastor here, our relationship now is working together for great things. So that's a long introduction to you, but I'm really grateful for you. And any chance I get to publicly talk about that, I praise God for your influence on my life.
That's very kind of you. And I have so many fond memories of 14 years or so. And I also remember the first time that I met you there. Two things. One was the news about your father-in-law's grave diagnosis was real fresh for you and your sister and your brother-in-law and your mother-in-law and so forth. And I also remember that time that we played basketball. For some reason, I volunteered to guard your brother-in-law, and I didn't know that he was a legit college basketball player. One of the dumber decisions I've ever made.
That's funny. I don't remember that, but I do remember. Remember just the way our relationship began, and you taking a quick interest in me, and just extremely grateful for that. So we're going to talk about the Great Commission today. We're talking about healthy churches. In this season of the podcast, we're talking about kind of the essential ministries of a healthy church. That's something that you and I have chatted about, for hours and hours. And today we're talking about how a healthy church is committed to the Great Commission, specifically about the Great Commission among the nations, to reach all the peoples of the earth with the gospel of Jesus. So before we get into this, you have a long missionary background. Talk about that a little bit. What was, you didn't become a pastor in the American church right away. So talk about a little bit of your calling into missions and why that has played such a central role into your heart, into Letitia's heart for so long too.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Warsaw-Winona Lake, Indiana area. Both my parents were professors at Grace College. And although the town is small, there were a lot of people passing through because of our Charis Fellowship of Churches. And that included people who were serving internationally, cross-culturally, missionaries, global workers, we might call them, in the 1970s and especially the 1980s. And so I had a larger than normal dose of encounters with people serving in cross-cultural ministry. So that planted seeds for me that began to bear fruit in my teenage years. I was always fascinated by culture, geography, languages, and I was fascinated by these people who were serving overseas and had the kind of life and the kind of calling or significance about what they were doing that was highly attractive to me. And so by the time I was finishing high school, I was quite interested in cross-cultural ministry as a career and an opportunity to serve God. That was confirmed in multiple ways in college through mentors, coursework, cross-cultural experiences. And so by the time Letitia and I got married, when she graduated a year after I graduated from college, we were planning on cross-cultural ministry. And indeed, a couple years later, we left for Germany and spent 10 years there with what was then called Grace Brethren International Missions, now known as Encompass World Partners. And so cross-cultural ministry has kind of been in my blood from the beginning, thanks to God and His unique way of steering me, just like He steers other people uniquely. And so on the heels of that, some further education, pastoral ministry for close to a dozen years now with Encompass. I feel like you can't take away the cross-cultural passions that I have, and that's not credit to me, that's the Lord working in my life.
So I can remember, even several years ago, just talking through ministry and different things that you could do. And I still remember you saying, or just I remember sensing in you just that call to the nations was still so central. Like, I mean, even as a local church pastor here in the United States, the way you led, the ministries that you initiated here, the way you were trying to steer our church at the time very much had a gospel to the nations mindset to it for us to be a healthy church that's being part of that. Now, the kind of ministry that you left here as the lead pastor, serving as lead pastor, many people would say, "Yeah, that's the goal. That's the kind of ministry I could last in for a long time." But you still sensed a call to to move into the executive director role out of a pastoral ministry. What were some of the things that were going on in your hearts for why that was necessary for you to kind of be called back into a role that had gospel to the nations more specifically in its charge and mindset?
Yeah, that's a long conversation. I'll try to keep it brief. Very content in a pastoral ministry here. The Lord created opportunities. Hopefully some of what we were doing and how I was leading was beneficial to the church. But there was a part of me, because of the previous decades in my life, that felt still a little bit dormant in pastoral ministry because of experience living overseas and a deep passion for the nations. And so when the opportunity came up to consider the executive director role with Encompass, that was a period of wrestling with God about what we should do. There was very little push factor from the church here, but there was certainly a pull factor that it would allow me to engage in a more overt way again in cross-cultural ministry and helping our efforts, not just as a church, but as a fellowship of churches, to increase among the nations. And so, God used those circumstances in different phases of my life, I think, to prepare me for this role, and hopefully it can be of value to our church and our churches.
So, in anyone who knows you, especially within our fellowship, I think I always knew that you were definitely the kind of person, if not the person, that made most sense for that role in terms of just, again, your passions, your leadership giftedness, your love of our fellowship, your heart for the nations. And as in that adjustments and all of us kind of adjusting to that together, knew that you were specifically called for this kind of ministry. And I'm grateful for how you lead our fellowship in ways. And now that I'm glad that we still get to work together in lots of ways too, in collaborating on, I think both of us would say, the most important cause in the world right now. So let's get in now to a little bit of kind of the essence of the Great Commission, God's plan for the nations, and how a local church is part of that. It's been remarkable in this season as we've talked about healthy church, even as we've talked about evangelism and discipleship, as we've talked about membership and accountability to one another, as we've talked about preaching. The Great Commission continues to come up in these conversations on a regular basis, but today we're going to talk about its specific, kind of leading us to the world. So I'll read it again. Matthew 28, verse 18, and Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. What is it about the Great Commission that leads us to care about the nations or all the peoples who have never heard? There could be all kinds of responses to that. We can say, oh yeah, I just make disciples here. It could be, sure, we see conversions and healthy churches established just locally where I am. But I'm almost certain you're going to say it's not just that. What is it that leads us to the nations from the Great Commission?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I think about the Great Commission, a couple of descriptors come to mind. One is Jesus is quite clear. There's a lot packed in to those few verses that we have in Matthew 28. It's pretty comprehensive. You could make a case for the Great Commission not just being in Matthew 28, but being at the end of each of the Gospels, or Acts 1:8. But the most comprehensive description, I think, is in Matthew 28. And it's full-orbed. It talks about disciple-making, going, baptizing, teaching to observe all that Jesus commanded, the authority of Jesus, the fact that Jesus' presence is with us always. But I would make the case that of all the things that stunned the disciples when they first heard that nothing stunned them more than when Jesus said, make disciples of the nations. That you can't make sense of the gravity of the Great Commission if that little phrase, panta ta ethne in the original language, of the nations, of the people groups, we might say, wasn't in there. And so when they heard that, they realized Jesus was talking about something that was far bigger than they imagined and seemed overwhelming to them. And I think even in our day, where the globe seems to have gotten smaller, it still should seem overwhelming and bigger than we can imagine. And that's a good thing, because that requires us to lean on the authority of Jesus and the presence of Jesus. And so the Great Commission without the nations is almost an oxymoron.
I love how you just put that. That's that might be controversial in some settings, actually, for people who just may not. It may seem like, yeah, that's a good idea, but there's enough. But what about all the believers, or what about all the non-Christians who are here? There's still a lot of work here to do. Why bother going to the nations with that? How would you respond to somebody who might object to that comment that the nations of the Great Commission, to not include them together, would be ridiculous? But people say, oh, I just need to reach the lost people who are right around me.
At one level, they're not wrong. We are called to be bearers of good news to everyone we encounter. And so there's nobody who's made in the image of God who is unworthy to hear the gospel. And so the Lord plants us in places, and for many of us doesn't move us from those places, to share the gospel, to bear witness to Jesus, because lost people matter no matter where they live. Right. However, when Jesus is describing the Great Commission, and this has all kinds of seeds back in the Old Testament, there is a special place in the heart of God for the various diverse people groups of the world. Mm-hmm. God wants those groups to be represented at the end of time. In fact, they will be represented at the end of time. And so it's not just about each individual or whoever's closest to me. It's about representation of people who have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb from all of those people groups, some easy, some close, many not, and very far away. And we live in a world now in which, because of communication and technology and transportation, we have more access to those people than ever before. That doesn't make the calling necessarily easier, because there's a spiritual element, resistance and so forth, but it does make it more attractive, even desirous for believers, because we can put our hands around that a little bit.
Right. And seeing, the Great Commission and God's heart for the nations as so central, really, you don't just start in the Gospels. You go back to Genesis 12, and in the covenant with Abraham, he says, I'm going to bless you so that in you all the families mm-hmm. of the earth will be blessed. Mm-hmm. Then just take that thread and pull it along the rest of the Bible. You see the nations mentioned all over the Psalms. Psalm 67, one of my favorite. Let the nations praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Isaiah talks so much about the nations that will be gathered in this Messiah who will even come and rule the nations as well. And then you connect these dots that, Acts 1:8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and all the ends of the earth. And then Revelation, as you mentioned already, it's like these people, it's not about the quantity of people there, just the number of the redeemed, but the quality of the families, the peoples who are gathered around. So God's heart for the nations is central to his plan from Genesis to Revelation. It's not just, a couple of texts that we're building this off of. So yeah, the Great Commission must be connected with the nations here as well. And part of, I think sometimes I've gotten pushback from this, not pushback, but questions. I think is people legitimately asking, why do we spend so much time talking about unreached people groups, again, when there are so many non-Christians here? And my response often is, you're here, we're here to reach the non-Christians exactly. there, or here. Like we have churches here. We have our church here that's meant to reach these people. What we're trying to do is to evaluate where is the greatest need around the world that we must send people there, because right now there's no one taking the gospel there. One of my favorite quotes about missions in all history is from one of our own guys, James Dribble, who when he wanted to go to Central Africa, he said, I wanted to go to the darkest, the densest, most spiritually dark place that not only where the gospel has never been proclaimed, but when no one has plans to preach him. And I think that's kind of the heartbeat of what we're saying in terms of we got to get to the places where Jesus has never been named.
Yeah, and even a statement like that, it sounds so bizarre and foreign to our ears because we're not used to thinking like that. We're used to thinking about what are the most tangible opportunities? What are the easiest opportunities? What are the opportunities that will bear the most fruit or have the most result? And that's not necessarily bad, but it makes us spiritually myopic. We're only seeing what's in front of us. And part of the reminder of Matthew 28 and the Great Commission is that it tells us what we're tempted to forget again and again in our ministries. It's not that when people say that they're wrong in putting an emphasis on the needs, the spiritual needs around us. It's that if we only look around us, we'll miss what is central to the heart of God, which is the nations.
I would argue a healthy church isn't having to choose between one or
Right.
the other. We're doing both.
Right.
Like, just because there's, let's say 100 healthy churches in Columbus doesn't mean there shouldn't be more. Like, I mean, we should be planting more churches. We should be evangelizing. We should be reaching people out. And we should also be doing, because I think a church that's doing that locally will then think about doing that globally.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to do both to say, yeah, and we need to get the gospel to the ends of the earth as well. So we're doing both of those things. We're not having to choose one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a healthy church, again, is thinking about both of those things. Now, and last, you've been in your role as the executive director for close to 3 years?
A little under 3 years.
A little under three. How many miles do you think you've flown in that 3 years?
I almost don't want to think of that. A lot. And I could probably check on various airlines that I fly with to figure that out. But it's a lot of miles. Usually it's a trip a year to East Asia, a trip at least once to Africa, several to or through Europe. So it's 4 or 5 international trips a year, and then a variety of much smaller trips here in the States. It's been a lot.
So I don't know how old people have to be to remember, the song "Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego," but there's a little bit of like "Where in the World is Mike Yoder," and but part of that vantage point now that you have as the executive director, thinking about these Great Commission priorities as your full-time role and responsibility. You don't have the other duties with shepherding a church so you can give a little bit more targeted focus. What do you see going on around the world right now? What are opportunities? What are challenges that are there? Just recently in our Mission Sunday, you kind of presented things going on each continent, which, hey, ripe for fruit or, man, difficult soil, but we need people there. But just maybe summarize a handful of things that you see going on around the world right now related to the Great Commission.
Yeah, so we're called to the nations, and those nations are found in every country, and in some countries, many, many different nations or people groups. And certainly that's true on all the continents. And one of the things that we observe when we look at the world is that it's not equally spiritually fertile. There are different levels of receptivity, different levels certainly of access for believers, whether they come from afar or nearby. And when we look at each of the continents, there's a history with each one of them. One of the things that I was thinking, actually, just as I was driving here today, was that when things are fruitful and grow, weeds also grow. And so you look at places like perhaps Latin America or Africa, where there is good spiritual fruit in many ways, and that's the product, spiritually speaking, of a lot of missionary investment and certainly the grace of God in their lives. A lot of believers, a lot of churches in those places, on those continents, but also a lot of distortions. And we can talk about health and wealth gospel, prosperity gospel, a lot of things that seem like a version of Christianity, but are really a distortion. And so where there's fruit, there are also weeds. You look at other places in the world, parts of Central or East Asia, in a certain way in Europe with its own unique history, and there's a lot of barrenness. It's not just that fruit doesn't grow, it's that not much at all grows, at least in terms of Christian faith. And so the challenges are different in each of those places, and the kinds of workers that we need are different in each of those places. In a place like Africa, we especially need trainers and mentors and those who are able to help healthy churches with godly leadership. That's also true in parts of Latin America. You go over to East Asia or Central Asia, and you're dealing with dominant world religions that have blinded the eyes of people through the work of Satan to the glory of the gospel. I think of 2 Corinthians 4, and God has to remove the blinders from people who have been spiritually duped by other worldviews and other faiths. You look at a place like Europe, where it's not so much other faiths, but a distorted version of Christianity or a veneer of Christianity that makes people think, been there, done that, when they really have never understood the gospel or the biblical message. So we have challenges in each place, but we also have opportunities everywhere we look. And of course, the main thing is we know Jesus is coming, but we don't know when. And so we want to be busy about the next few months, if he's to return in 2026, or busy about the next few decades or centuries if it's a long time until he returns. We want to be busy about the Great Commission, and he'll know when our calling is done.
That's great. I recently gave a devotional on what Jesus talks about. The person who's fit for following him is the one who keeps his hand to the plow, or no one who has their hand to the plow looks back. Mm-hmm. And there's something to be said for, exactly what you said. Look, as the Lord gives us breath and until he returns, let's be about the central need in the world. And that is people who are lost and dying, going to hell without trusting Christ. And there are people who, I think sometimes we just need to be amazed at the statistics to know that there are still billions of people who live among unreached people groups who have never heard the gospel and right now just don't have that many people taking the gospel to them. And when we consider that, like if we were to do the same thing with food, hunger, you would say, man, there's all these people. Like, yeah, there's all these people who literally have no food. Mm-hmm. Well, we have these other people with food. We need to care for them. We're going to make sure that they're mature and all that. But if there's no food over there, we got to find ways to get them resources so that they can live.
Exactly.
Why not do that with the bread of life and how necessary that is?
Yeah, and I think we also need to acknowledge the world that we live in. There are times in human history, even in my lifetime, where opportunities in other cultures and around the world seemed great, where the cultural background we have seemed like an advantage. Even when Letitia and I went in the late 1990s, that was a very different time in the world, and the idea of cross-cultural ministry seemed to have more appeal in our churches among believers. We're in 2025, we're in the mid-third decade of this millennium, and the world can seem like a very foreboding place, a very threatening, dangerous place. We can be so tempted to batten down the hatches, so to speak, and say, well, the time isn't ripe. Maybe the landscape will look better in the future. But the commission of Jesus never changes, and he never says, well, depending upon the difficulty, you can take a time out. You can pause and wait for better weather. No, we don't have that opportunity, and we shouldn't take it. Jesus calls us to keep our hand to the plow, including in Great Commission callings.
In the book of Acts and church history tells us that just because the weather doesn't look great doesn't mean the gospel can't make an impact.
That's right. In fact, sometimes when the weather isn't good, that's when it's most fruitful.
All the more.
Yeah.
And so I love how we've already had this conversation because we've talked a little bit about the biblical precedent for missions. We've given a little bit of some vision for, man, we think people should get behind this with their lives. Now let's talk about some logistics, some nuts and bolts. What does it look like for a healthy church to really participate in this? I've shared recently part of even my, I feel like, calling as a local church pastor. So far, the Lord could always change that, but to be here in the States, a missionary, former missionary asked me, Zac, have you ever considered global missions? And I said, yes, I have been praying about that a little while, and yet I still sense a call right now to the American church. And he said to me, he said, Zac, we need healthy churches to have healthy missions. So ever since then, I've always wanted my desire has always been to have as healthy a church as possible that's committed to the Great Commission so that we have healthy missions. So I would love to just kind of let's get real specific on what does that look like? What would be elements or ministries of a church that would say that church is committed, participating in the Great Commission to get the gospel to the ends of the earth?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we could talk about there. I'm reminded of the fact that in the New Testament era, God set apart, the Holy Spirit set apart people for apostolic or missionary work. Paul's situation was quite unique. Jesus met Paul on the road to Damascus, called Saul at the time, called him to be the tip of the spear for ministry to the Gentiles, all the non-Jews the world over. But if you look at the rest of the New Testament, that kind of calling almost never comes up. It's almost always in the context of local churches where there's good ministry happening, where there are leaders being formed, and where some of those leaders are being sent off, set apart for ministry in places where Jesus had not yet been named. Of course, we think of the story in Acts chapter 13 and the church at Antioch, which was a hodgepodge of various cultural backgrounds. And it lists leaders there, and it says that the Holy Spirit somehow, some way, called on the church to set apart certain gifted leaders because they were more needed elsewhere. And so the church, with an open hand, said, yes, we will do that. Why did the church do that? Well, it says in that very passage, they were worshiping and fasting. They were asking and showing God, we belong to you. What do you want to do with us? And you can have anyone you want because they don't belong to us. A church that thinks like that, nobody belongs to us everyone can be redeployed, redirected as God sees fit is a great place. And that ought to be inculcated from, the toddler class all the way to the senior saints. Everybody's saying, here am I, I'm breathing. How do you want to use me, Lord?
This is right out of Isaiah 6. It's, who will go? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me. And I almost wonder, this is just coming to me in this moment, any chance that the church at Antioch was praying exactly what Jesus taught his disciples to pray? Lord of the harvest, raise up workers. Like I wonder.
It's possible they were praying that, and if they weren't, certainly their heart disposition was showing that.
Absolutely. So a healthy church prays and raises up workers. And part of why we have global workers interviewed on Sundays or back with kids ministries or just around or that we're praying through lists like that in our church is so that kind of like to have your experience and my experience. We just kind of knew the gospel of the nations was just kind of normal. And there was a normal way of talking about it within our congregation. It seemed there's something healthy about that. So praying for, training, raising up workers, other things that you might suggest for local churches to participate in the Great Commission.
Well, certainly in all the ministries of a local church, we ought to be biblically saturated. In other words, we ought to have our noses in the scriptures to see how God was working back then, the early church. We also ought to be a church that is aware of what's happening in the world. And that may not be a primary emphasis on Sunday mornings where we put emphasis on the scriptures and on body life together. But being Great Commission Christians means that we're aware of what's happening in the world. We see needs, we see opportunities. And so we're not fearful of the news, we're not fearful of what's happening in our world, but we're sober because we realize we're called to be gospel people in the world there. I think a healthy local church is helping its members understand the value of knowing what's going on and being ready to be redirected or redeployed as necessary.
This has helped me recently as our church is growing a little bit more multi-ethnic, multicultural, to have some people from another part of the world say, hey, did you hear what went on in our country with believers there? Would you pray for that? And it's like just having people inform me even, oh, this went on. And you may not always know, but our church, as it grows more multi-ethnic, I think is helping us become more aware of what's going on in a variety of parts of the world. It's been good.
And one of the things that we talk about at Encompass, we talk about praying, giving, welcoming, sending, and going. All of us can pray, and we should. All of us can give, and we should. We have different income levels, different capacities, but investing in not only the local church, but in the Great Commission is right and proper. Whether we're going to be senders or welcomers or goers, we may not be all three of those, but one of those at least should be part of the mix of our contribution to the Great Commission. And so we want to pursue that. A healthy church reminds every member, every individual that you have a part to play.
Wish we could keep going. We're going to have to stop this. Maybe we'll come back for part 2 at some point because I think this conversation is so necessary. But Mike, I want to thank you and your work and endeavors to lead Encompass, to make disciples of the nations. I just keep coming back to Philippians 1 verse 5 or verse 4. I always remember you making every prayer of mine for every prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Mike, I'm grateful to be a partner with you in the gospel to the nations.
It's a privilege to serve Encompass, and it's a deep, deep honor to serve from this church.
Praise God.